Nationals week 1 just ended, and Lexi still looks like the most broken hero. Today, we're going to break down the classic constructed metagame, do another one of my monthly tier list videos here. I love making these. We're going to look at what the meta looks like after all of the Nationals that happened this last weekend. Primarily we had the calling Las Vegas and the U.S. Nationals both on the same weekend. Those are going to be the biggest Nationals of the whole season, so that's going to be a lot of data to look at right there and just take a look at what the results were and what the meta looks like from there, right? So starting out with kind of the easy ones at the top, we've got Lexi here. So I'm going to pull Lexi over here and put her in S tier. Lexi put the most of any hero into almost basically every top 8 of Nationals. She's been the deck to beat. No one's really surprised Lexi's in here. She's definitely weaker than she was when she had bullseye bracers, but she's still quite strong. She can still do the most high power turns in Flesh and Blood with Rain Razors and Three of a Kind, and supporting that even with Codex of Frailty. So I don't want to talk too much about Lexi, but she's definitely the strongest pick. And usually, at least historically in Flesh and Blood, the strongest deck is a pretty linear, aggressive deck. This isn't always the case because Oldham was pretty good for a while. But generally speaking, there were 2 Rune Blades and then there was Star of the Show, and all of those were more aggressive linear decks, right? So Lexi kind of follows that pattern. Linear is maybe a little rude to Lexi. She has some pretty interesting lines she can take, but she's still a pretty strong aggro deck that has the game plan of just killing the opponent and not blocking very much. Also in S tier, probably also not surprises though, we've got Icelander and Dromi here, right? So all the ladies in S tier. Icelander has proven to be quite strong, despite what people initially thought. I think this is mostly on the back of Warmonger's Diplomacy. That card is just a little too good. There's almost no downside to playing it, even in other heroes. It's just a blue 3-block, so it's always quite good. But it has some really strong text too, and Icelander gets to play it as an instant, so it's much, much better in her. And so that card's a huge power boost for Icelander. Lexi losing her Bullseye Bracers is a nice buff to Icelander. And so overall, Icelander got quite a few things that put her in a good position for this metagame. And then Dromi is kind of the deck that is here to prey on these first 2 decks. Dromi has a pretty good matchup into Lexi and Icelander. She has permanence, and neither of those decks are quite good at doing that. Neither of them have an actual weapon that attacks. Actually, none of these 3 decks have a weapon that attacks, which is a really interesting thing I just noticed. But Dromi putting permanence out makes it so that neither of these heroes can easily clear her dragons with a weapon like Bravo or a Ninja could, right? So that puts her in a pretty good spot. Her weakness, you'd think if she's good into those other 2 decks, why isn't she the best deck? It's mostly that she's weak into a lot of aggro, right? Any deck that has a lot of on hits can just hit her dragons, get good on hits through that, and get a little more value than she can keep up with. And she also struggles into any deck with a lot of poppers. So, while she's really good and probably the counter to the 2 other best decks, she's going to struggle into the lower tier decks where Lexi and Icelander kind of have the opposite. Lexi and Icelander are going to be good into most decks, especially the lower tier decks, but are going to struggle into some of the silver bullet decks like Dromi, and then there's going to be a few in A tier as well that are kind of silver bullet decks to beat these S tier heroes. And in S tier as well, I know Briar is hitting Living Legend, our 4th lady of S tier. So she's not really you're not gonna have to consider this deck too much after this national season ends. But Briar, Fatigue Briar particularly, just took down the Nationals for the U.S. Nationals, and that deck seems quite strong. Charles Dunn had an insane showing through the whole weekend. Fatigue Briar looks really good, but also regular Briar is still quite strong. There was, in that same top 8 at U.S. Nationals, there was also the Channel Mount Heroic Briar. So not only are both of those decks pretty strong, both ways you can play Briar, but the fact that you can't be sure what Briar is going to be on makes it even better for Briars, because you can pick either one and your opponent might just sideboard wrong before the game start, and then you have a much, much higher chance of winning if they sideboarded to beat Fatigue, and now they've got these slower cards like Remembrance, and you're on aggro, and you just kill them when they have cards that don't block. Or the reverse, you're on aggro, and they sideboard out all of their defense reactions and more defensive cards to beat Fatigue. Both ways, it's pretty good for Briar. So She's in a great spot right now. I think I would recommend the fatigue build in general. It seems quite strong. But I think either version of Briar is pretty good. And if you want to play an aggro deck that's not Lexi, Channel Not Heroic Briar is still quite strong. So I would say this is probably the S tier right now. Once again, Briar is hitting Living Legend, which is already confirmed. We actually do have a chance that Lexi or Icelander could hit Living Legend. So we'll have to keep an eye on that. But at the end of national season, depending on how many events Lexi and Icelander wins, we could see them, one or both of them, hitting Living Legend along with Briar, which would be obviously quite a big shakeup to the metagame. But I do think we probably need quite a few, like maybe 3 to 5 heroes to Living Legend, just to keep the meta at a decent size. I think they might need to increase how many points they give out for Living Legend. I think the meta right now is probably as big as a meta should get. And so if they're releasing a new set, every set you'd probably want almost as many heroes to Living Legend as are being released. Otherwise, you'll eventually have a roster of like 100 heroes. And there's almost no way to sideboard for that. You're just going to play events and just lose because you can't prepare for everything if the field gets that big. So I think if all three heroes, Lexi, Icelander, and Briar, Living Legend, that would be the best case scenario for the game and the health of the game. Because then we would have 3 Living Legend heroes, and then there would be 3 new heroes joining the meta from Bright Lights at the same time. So I think that would be the best case scenario. And if we got 4 or 5, we're not going to this season, but I think we're maybe a little too many heroes in the meta right now. So if we could shrink the meta down just a little bit, I think we'd be in a better spot. But I think the meta's fine as it is. But if, for example, if no heroes had Living Legend and then we gained 3 more, that would be a bit of a problem. A tier, I think, is going to be pretty big. I actually think this is a fairly healthy meta. You can see there's 4 viable heroes in S tier, while Lexi seems like the easy pick to just lock in, and I do think generally she is. There's quite a few ways to counter her. Icelander and Dromi and Fatigue Briar, all the other 3 decks in S tier seem to beat her pretty well. And then Bravo and Azuri right here in A tier also both have pretty solid matchups into Lexi. Nothing's just going to completely dunk on Lexi because she's just that strong. But these heroes all can beat her. All of these other 5 heroes all have a pretty solid chance, if not favorable matchup into Lexi. And so I think, this meta is not like Starvo meta. It's not completely one-sided. There's quite a lot of viable picks. And if you look at a lot of the top 8s over the weekend, there's, every one of these heroes basically, and even more than this, have made it into a top 8. And, the meta is pretty open overall. So I'm really happy with the current meta. Obviously I think it's maybe time for some of these heroes to leave. I think Icelander and Lexi, maybe it's their time. Actually, I love Briar, so I'm not huge that she's leaving, but I do like the Living Legend system, so I'm okay with it. And so I think it's good that we're having this meta shift, but I think it was a pretty healthy meta overall. Joining these 2 disruptive heroes in A tier, I think we have a few other, I guess, these aren't disruptive heroes, but they're good at attacking Lexi and then beating some of the other decks. I think Phi and Dorinthia are in A tier. Phi has basically 6 Command and Conquers in his deck. He can play 3 Breaking Point and 3 Command and Conquer, which gives him a lot of ways to, at a good rate and a lot of damage, disrupt the arsenal on Lexi, which is super nice. He's also just a pretty solid aggro deck overall. And Dorinthia is also in a pretty solid spot. She can play either the Fatigue, Decimator, Great Axe plan, which is not bad at all. That weapon's very strong. Or she can play the Dawnblade plan, the classic Dorinthia plan, and that plan is also pretty good. She gets quite a lot of equipment block, and Dawnblades are a very strong weapon. She has some good cards from, I guess, not as recent now, but somewhat recent sets with the Glistening Steel Blade. So I think overall, she's in a pretty solid spot. She's always been good at racing other aggro decks because she blocks so well, and then also has a weapon with a solid on-hit that they have to keep blocking at some point. So they're both in there. And then I would say Dash is kind of taking a look at the other heroes here. I think, Dash is probably the last hero in A tier. Dash is the hero that you can, if you're good enough with her, you can take her to almost any event since she's been released. Like, since Dash has been released, she's always been able to win callings, and she has never spent too long not top 8ing or winning an event since she released. She's just so consistent. She's able to easily pivot into the items game plan against control decks, and into the racing game plan to try to outrace other aggro decks. She's only gotten more and more strong tools with Teclo Pounder, with Pulse Wave Harpoon. And so I think she's slowly just getting stronger. I think she's going to get much stronger unless the other version of Dash is stronger. But I think Mech in general is obviously getting a massive boost with Bright Lights. But I think she's already in a pretty good spot. So I think there's a very high chance that there is an S tier Mech hero or multiple Mech heroes after Bright Lights. I wouldn't be surprised if I mean, I'm hoping this isn't the case, but I wouldn't be surprised if they maybe overtune it because mech is already pretty strong, and then the S tier is just like 3 mech heroes. But I don't think that's the case. Flesh and Blood's pretty good at balancing. LSS is pretty good at balancing, so I do expect there to be an S tier mech hero after Bright Lights, but I don't think it's going to be like Mech Winter or anything like that. At least I hope not. But all that to say, Dash is pretty strong. She really rewards people who know her in and out. If you watch a really high level Dash player, you'll just be appalled at how good they are at the hero and how good she looks, despite how basic her cards are. Like most of her cards have no text other than boost or are pretty simple overall, but people are able to play her really, really well. And I don't know if she won any events this weekend. She might have. I haven't seen every single result. She did make day 2 pretty consistently. She did make a few top 8s, and I think overall she's in a pretty strong spot right now. So I think all 9 of these heroes are pretty viable. You get a huge pool to pick from. I mean, I think all of these are different classes too. Yeah, I'm pretty sure all of these are a different class. So that's like 9 viable classes, 9 different heroes that are all pretty viable. It's a really nice open meta game. Yeah, I mean, I really enjoy this meta overall. I wish I could play more events in this meta. Honestly, I wish it would last a little longer. Maybe like a nerf or 2 to Lexi and Icelander. And then I think the meta would be good. Like I think maybe you take 1 or 2 cards away from Lexi and Icelander, and then we have a pretty nice meta, like an even better meta. But I think overall this meta is super solid. Moving down to B tier though, this tier is also pretty full. I think there's not that many heroes that are complete garbage. So I guess I should say I don't know if I need 5 tiers here, but I'd say like the heroes that I wouldn't say you could play are probably just Arachne and Riptide. Like I think those are the only 2 heroes that I think seem to be largely unplayable. I think maybe Vincent is like bordering on it. She's either like the best of the bad heroes or she's in C tier. She just doesn't seem to be able to do as good in longer games like Classic Constructed. She's very strong in Blitz, but in Classic Constructed, it seems like the games go a little too long for her. So she's maybe high D tier or C tier. I'll put her in high D tier. These aren't really ordered, by the way. Like the tier, I mean, they're kind of ordered. Like sometimes I'll add them in terms of power, but generally, I don't think Bravo's like that much better than the other heroes in the tier. But you know, they're a little ordered. So I think these are probably the 3 heroes that are really quite bad. Other than that, I mean, I guess I'll use all 5 tiers. I think Bolton, I should say, along with Prism, Levia, Rhinar, maybe Viserai. Viserai is also kind of bordering 2 tiers. These are the C tier heroes. They like have builds that are strong, and I think a lot of these heroes are just not solved yet. Like primarily, especially the Dusk Till Dawn heroes. Like all 3 of these heroes at the front, they just got support so recently, like within the last few weeks. I think Prism, especially Aura Prism and Levia, could be quite strong. I just don't think people have quite figured them out yet into the build that's going to be strong like that, or maybe they're just a few cards short and they need like 1 more supplemental set to be good. But I think those heroes are like bordering on being powerful. And then in the middle, we've kind of got this like U-shape. Yeah, I didn't really mean to mirror it. I did not mean to do this, but it's kind of mirrored, I guess. But in the B tier, we've got some heroes that are like good sometimes, and then also they just have some matchups that are so bad that it's not going to work out. Katsu's generally pretty good. He's just not. He's like just a little weaker than the other aggressive decks up here. He's just not quite there. He's quite strong. I mean, I think he did really good in Poland, which, I mean, the Polish love Katsu. But I mean, he's pretty solid overall. I just think he's like, I don't know, he's just not quite there for some reason. And then we've got Kano. Kano's just always able to Aether Wildfire combo people. I mean, he can also just fall flat on his face. I mean, he's got matchups. I think the Icelander matchup is pretty hard from him from what I've heard. So that is a bit of a problem with how popular she is right now. Dromi can also be an issue. And then if the Lexi is aggressive enough, and especially if they're playing Shock Charmers, the fact that both of these heroes are lightning and can play Shock Charmers with Lexi and Briar is another problem for Kano. If people respect him that are on those lists, and you never know if they are or aren't. But once again, he can always just deal like 50 damage on turn 0 sometimes, right? So Kano always gets a little respect in my book. And then Azalea, I think Azalea is maybe also like bordering. I think Azalea and Katsu are both like tier 1.5. Like this is tier 0, this is tier 1. They're like 1.5. Like these heroes are like strong. They're just not quite as strong. They're really close, but like Azalea can really beat some of these aggro decks. Like she can really dunk on Lexi if she gets there. But I think her problem is that one, she's pretty disrupted by Warmonger's diplomacy, which is everywhere right now. And she's also in the crossfire of all the arsenal disruption that Lexi's facing. There's a ton of anti-ranger hate in the meta right now, and Azalea just kind of takes the heat for that with Lexi. And then she's got some consistency issues, but she just has such a powerful line she can take with dominated, pumped up red in the ledgers. There's some games you're going to feel like you're the strongest hero in the whole game, but then some games she's just going to not find the dominated red in the ledgers or hit a matchup where they play a lot of defense reactions they can get off, and she's going to feel quite weak. So she's a little high rolly, I guess, from what I've seen. But this is where I'd say the meta is right now. I do think it's a pretty nice meta. Like I said, I'm excited for Bright Lights. I think Bright Lights is going to be hopefully a nice meta as well. I really like the new hero that they showed off that can play stuff at instant speed. I think instants are always quite strong. I've got my eyes on him for being potentially the strongest hero from Bright Lights, but yeah, instants are just good. We've seen with Icelander and Voltaire now that stuff at instant speed is always quite good. So definitely got our eyes on. I think his name's like Teklo or Tesla or something. But yeah, our eyes on him. The meta looks really good. Remember to like, subscribe, comment. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.